The Colonial Parkway runs like a ribbon through Virginia's historic triangle, a 22-mile stretch linking Jamestown, Williamsburg, and Yorktown. A scenic road whose long, dark curves and isolated overlooks made it a favored lover's lane in the 1980s. What began as ordinary nights on a quiet road became, between 1986 and 1989, a string of double homicides and disappearances that would unsettle communities across the region and confound investigators for decades. The first known victims were found in October 1986. Two young women discovered in a parked car at an overlook, their deaths at once intimate and brutal. Over the next 3 years, similar scenes recurred. Young couples or pairs, often white and in their late teens or 20s, found shot or missing near the parkway's overlooks and adjacent waterways. The pattern was chilling. Isolated locations, vehicles parked at scenic pullouts, and victims who appeared to be on dates or short drives. Circumstances that suggested a predator who used the road's seclusion as cover. Local law enforcement faced a difficult terrain. The parkway stretches are long and largely unlit. Witnesses were rare and forensic technology of the era limited. Investigators cataloged scenes that shared certain signatures. Vehicles left at overlooks, evidence of struggle in or near cars, and victims who had been shot at close range. But the links between scenes were never conclusively proven in court. The killings produced fear and speculation in college towns and military communities that bordered the parkway, and they drew regional and national attention as the pattern hardened into the idea of a serial offender. The public narrative was shaped by both official updates and grassroots inquiry. Families of victims pressed for answers. Local media serialized developments, and true crime communities later compiled timelines and theories that kept the case alive long after the headlines faded. In recent years, advocacy groups and independent investigators have pointed to suspects and new leads, claims that have sometimes been amplified online and in podcasts, though official closure remained elusive for many years. For the people who lived along the parkway, the murders altered how they used the road. Lovers' lanes emptied, late-night drives became fraught, and a scenic route acquired a darker reputation. For investigators, the case posed a classic challenge of geography and time: how to connect crimes that occurred in isolated pockets across a broad landscape, with limited physical evidence and few reliable witnesses. The valley of silence that followed each discovery made the next night's drive feel like a risk, and the parkway itself became a character in the story. Beautiful, remote, and unforgiving. The first bodies were found where the parkway's beauty folded into its danger, at overlooks and pullouts where the road widened into a small, private world. Investigators arrived at scenes that felt intimate and ordinary at once. Cars parked under pines, cigarette butts and ashtrays, a blanket half tucked over a passenger seat, and then, beneath that ordinariness, the blunt fact of violence. The earliest scenes shared a cruel intimacy. Young people who had been on dates or short drives, interrupted and killed where they thought themselves alone. Local law enforcement moved quickly but cautiously. Patrol officers secured perimeters, county detectives photographed scenes, and coroners cataloged wounds and positions. The parkway's jurisdictional patchwork, state park police, county sheriffs, and municipal departments complicated the first days of the inquiry. Information had to be shared across agencies that did not always have established channels for cooperation, and that delay cost time in a landscape where footprints and tire tracks could be erased by a single ring. Forensics in the late 1980s offered tools that earlier generations lacked, but they were not yet the omnipotent science of later decades. Crime scene technicians collected shell casings, latent prints, fibers, and blood samples. Ballistics comparisons could link bullets to weapons if a firearm was recovered, and serology could suggest contact between victims and assailants. DNA testing existed but was expensive and slow, and many early samples were not preserved with the rigor later standards would demand. Investigators learned to treat each physical trace as precious and fragile, knowing that a single misstep in collection or storage could close off avenues of inquiry. Pattern recognition became the investigator's lodestar. Detectives compared victim profiles, age, gender, clothing, and last known movements, and scene signatures, vehicle placement, evidence of struggle, and the presence or absence of personal items. The repetition of certain elements suggested a predator who favored the parkway's seclusion and who understood how to exploit lovers' lanes. Yet the pattern was not perfect. Some scenes had clear signs of a struggle, others left few clues, and a few victims simply vanished without a trace. Those inconsistencies made it difficult to say, with confidence, whether all the cases were the work of a single offender or of several opportunists using the same terrain. Community response shaped the investigation as much as the evidence did. College students, military families, and tourists who once treated the parkway as a scenic shortcut began to avoid it at night. Local media ran frequent updates, and rumors filled the gaps that official statements left open. Families of victims organized, pressed for resources, and sometimes criticized police for perceived slowness or secrecy. That public pressure pushed agencies to coordinate more closely, to hold joint briefings, and to pool forensic resources, but it also risked contaminating witness memory and amplifying unverified leads. Detectives experimented with tactics that ranged from stakeouts at known pullouts to canvassing nearby neighborhoods for anyone who might have seen an unfamiliar car or person. They interviewed tow truck drivers, park maintenance crews, and the occasional late-night jogger. Some leads proved dead ends. Others produced small but useful details: a license plate fragment, a partial description of a vehicle, a time window that narrowed a suspect's opportunity. Each fragment was a small victory in a case that demanded patience and methodical accumulation of facts. By the chapter's end, the early investigation had established a working hypothesis. The Parkway killings were not random accidents, but a series of targeted attacks exploiting the road's isolation. That hypothesis guided resources and shaped public messaging, but it did not yet produce arrests or definitive answers. The hunt had begun in earnest, and investigators understood that solving the case would require not only forensic skill, but also sustained cooperation across jurisdictions and the careful preservation of every trace the night could not reclaim. As the pattern of killings hardened, investigators began to weave threads from scattered scenes into a working portrait of a predator. Detectives compared vehicle descriptions, shell casings, and the small, repeated details that suggested a single offender or a tightly clustered group of opportunists. The Parkway's geography, long stretches of dark road, isolated overlooks, and nearby waterways, offered both cover and constraint. A killer could move quickly between scenes, but the same terrain also produced repeatable traces that careful police work might one day link. Early suspect lists were broad and often frustratingly vague. Patrol officers chased reports of unfamiliar cars and men seen near pullouts. Tips poured in from anxious residents and transient visitors. Some leads were promising but evaporated under scrutiny. A license plate that turned out to be stolen. A witness who misremembered a make and model. A local with a criminal record whose alibi held up. The patchwork of jurisdictions, state park police, county sheriffs, and municipal detectives meant that leads sometimes stalled at bureaucratic seams, and the killer, if mobile, could exploit those gaps. Investigators experimented with profiling the offender from scene signatures. The choice of victims, often couples or pairs in parked cars, suggested someone who targeted intimacy and isolation rather than random public violence. The use of a firearm at close range, the placement of bodies near water or brush, and the occasional absence of obvious robbery pointed to a motive beyond theft. Detectives debated whether the killer acted opportunistically, escalating from assault to murder, or whether the attacks were premeditated ambushes designed to exploit the Parkway's known vulnerabilities. Forensic work produced both hope and frustration. Ballistics linked some casings across scenes, suggesting a common weapon or type of firearm, while latent prints and fibers yielded partial leads that rarely produced definitive matches. In a few cases, DNA evidence collected later from preserved items would reopen possibilities, but at the time, the technology was nascent, and samples were often degraded by exposure to weather or by imperfect collection. Each piece of physical evidence had to be treated as fragile and potentially decisive, and the investigators learned to balance urgency with meticulous preservation. Community pressure shaped investigative priorities. College campuses and military bases near the Parkway demanded visible action. Parents and local leaders called for increased patrols and lighting at known pullouts. Police responded with stakeouts, increased signage, and public safety campaigns urging people not to park alone at night. Those measures reduced some opportunities but could not erase the underlying fear. Families of victims organized support groups and advocacy efforts, pressing for resources and for a coordinated task force that could bridge jurisdictional divides. As months passed without an arrest, theories multiplied. Some detectives pursued the idea of a transient offender, someone passing through the region who used the parkway's anonymity to strike and then move on. Others suspected a local with intimate knowledge of the road's rhythms and blind spots. Amateur sleuths and local journalists compiled timelines and cross-referenced sightings, sometimes producing useful leads and sometimes amplifying rumors. The case's public profile grew, and with it the difficulty of separating credible information from noise. By the chapter's end, the investigation had moved from reactive policing to a more strategic posture. Coordinated task forces, pooled forensic resources, and a sustained effort to map the parkway's incidents against broader patterns of regional crime. Detectives understood that solving the killings would require patience, interagency cooperation, and the careful preservation of every trace the night could not reclaim. The road remained beautiful and dangerous, and the hunt for answers continued along its dark curves. One crime scene can change the shape of an investigation. On a humid summer night, a patrolman found a car pulled into a small turnout beneath a stand of loblolly pines. The vehicle's headlights were off. The engine was cold. Inside, two young people lay slumped, one in the driver's seat, one half out on the passenger side, both shot at close range. The tableau was intimate and terrible. A date interrupted, a life extinguished where lovers once sought privacy. That scene, more than any single headline, forced investigators to reckon with the killer's method and the fragile margin between ordinary nights and lethal violence. Forensic technicians treated the turnout as a fragile archive. They photographed the car from every angle, mapped the positions of bodies and personal effects, and cataloged trace evidence. Cigarette butts, a torn sleeve, a smear of blood on the door jamb, and a single shell casing lodged in the leaf litter nearby. Ballistic specialists compared the casing to others recovered from earlier scenes. The rifling marks suggested a common weapon, or at least a consistent class of firearm. Latent prints were lifted from the steering wheel and door handles, though many prints were partial or smudged by the victim's movements. Each fragment was a potential key, but each also carried the risk of contamination in a place where rain, insects, and curious onlookers could erase or alter what mattered most. The handling of biological material proved decisive in later years. Technicians collected blood swabs and fibers and stored them under the protocols then available, aware that DNA testing was still in its infancy. Those samples would later be re-examined with more sensitive methods, but the initial collection and preservation shaped what could be learned decades after the fact. Investigators learned the hard lesson that early scene management, who cordoned the area, how evidence was bagged, and whether chain of custody forms were completed, could determine whether a lead would survive the slow arc of forensic progress. Witnesses at the turnout offered small, contradictory details. A motorist passing earlier that night remembered seeing a dark sedan parked at the overlook but could not recall a license plate. A jogger reported hearing a single gunshot around midnight. A maintenance worker later said he had seen a flashlight beam moving along the shoulder. Those recollections narrowed time windows and suggested movement patterns, but they also illustrated the unreliability of memory under stress and the ease with which rumor could harden into apparent fact. Detectives learned to treat such accounts as probabilistic inputs, useful when corroborated, dangerous when taken alone. The scene also revealed behavioral signatures. The victim's personal items, wallets left untouched, jewelry in place, argued against robbery as a motive. The placement of bodies near the waterline and the absence of obvious sexual assault in some cases suggested a killer whose aim was control and elimination rather than theft or sexual predation. Investigators debated whether the killer intended to stage scenes to mislead or whether the recurring elements simply reflected the opportunities the parkway offered. That debate shaped search strategies. Stakeouts at pullouts, surveillance of likely escape routes, and checks of local pawn shops and scrap dealers for weapons or stolen items. Interagency coordination was tested at the turnout. County detectives, state park police, and municipal crime scene units had to reconcile different procedures and priorities while preserving evidence and managing public information. The scene's proximity to multiple jurisdictions forced a practical question. Who led, who documented, And how would information be shared without compromising prosecutions? The answer evolved through necessity, joint task forces, shared evidence lockers, and regular briefings. But the early confusion underscored how geography and bureaucracy can be as consequential as the killer's choices. By the chapter's end, that single turnout had done more than add 2 names to a list of victims. It crystallized investigative priorities, exposed procedural weaknesses, and produced forensic traces that would be re-examined for years. The scene taught detectives that the Parkway's beauty masked a forensic urgency. Every overlook was a fragile archive, and every night could be the night when a single, decisive clue would finally break the case open. I will draft Chapter 5 next, focusing on investigative breakthroughs and the first major suspect leads. Months of methodical work produced the first tangible breakthroughs. Ballistics links between shell casings at separate overlooks, a partial latent print on a car door handle, and a set of tire tracks that suggested a recurring vehicle type. These technical connections gave detectives something to hold on to, evidence that could be tested, compared, and traced, so the investigation shifted from broad canvas to targeted inquiry. Forensic technicians re-examined preserved exhibits, and detectives began to overlay physical traces with timelines and witness windows to narrow suspect pools. The creation of a multi-agency task force changed the investigation's tempo. State park police, county sheriffs, and municipal detectives agreed to share evidence lockers, coordinate patrols, and centralize tips. That coordination produced leads that single agencies had missed. Investigators ran license plate checks, interviewed repeat visitors to the parkway, and cross-referenced local criminal records for people with access to the road at odd hours. Some names rose to the top of lists because of proximity, suspicious behavior, or inconsistent alibis. Several suspects emerged and then faded under scrutiny. One local man with a history of violence was detained after a witness placed the car like his nearest scene, but forensic comparisons and a solid alibi eventually cleared him. Another lead focused on a transient who matched a composite sketch. He was questioned and released when no physical link could be established. Each false lead taught the team to tighten standards for probable cause and to document the chain of custody more rigorously to preserve prosecutorial options. Public pressure both helped and hindered progress. Media attention generated new tips and kept resources flowing to the task force, but sensational reporting also produced false sightings and contaminated memories. Detectives learned to manage information carefully, releasing only verified facts and asking the public for corroborated details, while families of victims pushed for arrests and answers that forensic evidence had not yet delivered. By the chapter's end, the investigation had matured into a disciplined, evidence-driven effort with clearer priorities. Preserve every trace, test every plausible lead, and coordinate across jurisdictions to prevent the killer from exploiting bureaucratic seams. The breakthroughs of this phase did not yet yield a conviction, but they established the forensic and organizational foundations that would make later advances, new testing methods, and renewed inquiries possible. The investigation that had begun with urgency and forensic promise gradually ran into the limits of time, technology, and human fallibility. Early leads that once seemed promising dissolved under scrutiny. Alibis checked out, forensic comparisons proved inconclusive, and witnesses recanted or faded from memory. Each setback narrowed the list of immediate options and widened the sense that the Parkway killings might slip into the long, frustrating category of unsolved crimes. Some of the investigation's most painful failures were procedural. Evidence collected in the first frantic days, clothing, cigarette butts, and small biological samples, was not always preserved to later standards. Chain of custody forms were incomplete in places. Storage conditions varied across agencies, and some items were discarded or misplaced before modern DNA testing became routine. Those gaps did not prove guilt or innocence, but they did close off avenues that later forensic advances might have exploited. Public anxiety shaped police work in ways that were both helpful and harmful. Media scrutiny and community demands kept resources flowing and produced new tips, but they also created incentives for quick answers and visible arrests. Detectives sometimes pursued leads that were sensational rather than solid, and the resulting false starts eroded public confidence. Families of victims, exhausted by uncertainty, alternated between gratitude for attention and frustration at the slow pace of definitive results. The Parkway's governance, state, county, and municipal authorities sharing responsibility, continued to complicate coordination. Information sometimes moved slowly across agency lines. Evidence lockers were managed under different protocols, and investigative priorities varied with local politics. Over time, task force structures improved cooperation, but early friction allowed the killer, if mobile, to exploit seams in enforcement and to remain elusive. By the early 1990s, the killings had receded from daily headlines. Patrols continued, and detectives kept the files active, but the steady stream of new, verifiable leads had dried up. The Parkway itself returned to a quieter rhythm by day, though at night the memory of the murders lingered in the minds of residents and visitors. Cold case investigators kept the files alive, periodically re-examining exhibits as forensic science advanced. But for a long stretch, the case remained unresolved. Even without arrests, the Parkway murders reshaped local life. Lovers' lanes emptied for years. Community events and campus orientations included warnings about late-night driving. And a generation of residents learned to treat the road with caution. For law enforcement, the case became a lesson in evidence preservation, interagency cooperation, and the need to resist the pressure for premature conclusions. For families, the absence of closure left a persistent ache that would fuel advocacy and later reopenings of the investigation. By the chapter's close, the investigation had not failed for lack of effort, but because of the combined weight of imperfect evidence, procedural lapses, and the killer's apparent ability to exploit the Parkway's geography and jurisdictional complexity. The trail had gone cold, but the files remained, waiting for new methods, new witnesses, or a break that might one day turn fragments into answers. Years of silence gave way to renewed attention as forensic science and investigative practice advanced. Cold case units revisited the Parkway files with fresh eyes, re-examining photographs, retesting preserved evidence, and applying techniques that were unavailable in the 1980s and 1990s. What had once been degraded swabs, partial prints, and ambiguous fibers became candidates for modern analysis. The possibility that a single overlooked trace could now yield a lead reshaped the tone of the investigation from resigned to hopeful. Laboratories applied improved serology, more sensitive DNA amplification, and computerized ballistics comparisons to archived exhibits. Where the chain of custody and storage had been imperfect, analysts worked carefully to document limitations while extracting whatever genetic or microscopic information remained. In some cases, partial profiles were developed that could be compared against national databases. In others, investigators used familial searching and emerging genetic genealogy techniques to generate investigative leads rather than immediate identifications. The modern reopening required institutional fixes as much as scientific ones. Agencies formalized task forces that bridged county, state, and federal lines, created centralized evidence repositories, and adopted standardized protocols for cold case review. That organizational shift reduced the bureaucratic seams that had once slowed information flow and allowed detectives to pursue leads across jurisdictions without losing momentum. Podcasts, documentaries, and online communities renewed public interest and produced new witnesses willing to come forward. People who had been reluctant to speak decades earlier, neighbors, seasonal workers, or former service members, offered recollections that, while imperfect, sometimes supplied time windows or vehicle descriptions that aligned with re-examined forensic data. Media attention also pressured agencies to be transparent about methods and findings, balancing the need for public accountability with the risk of contaminating fragile leads. Modern leads produced both promise and frustration. Some persons of interest were identified through genealogical leads or through re-interviewed witnesses, but many of those leads required corroboration that the surviving physical record could not always provide. Investigators moved cautiously, aware that public naming without prosecutable evidence could harm innocent lives and undermine future prosecutions. Where possible, agencies sought corroborative evidence, phone records, service logs, or independent witness statements, before elevating a suspect to public notice. The reopening renewed community conversations about safety, memory, and institutional responsibility. Families of victims found renewed energy for advocacy and for memorialization. Local governments invested in improved lighting, signage, and patrol coordination, and law enforcement agencies incorporated lessons about evidence preservation and interagency cooperation into training. The parkway itself remained a scenic route, but the renewed inquiry reminded residents that vigilance and careful procedure are essential to preventing and solving violent crime. By the chapter's end, the case had moved from cold files to active inquiry. Science had expanded the realm of possibility, institutional reforms had smoothed cooperation, and public engagement had produced new inputs. The mystery was not solved in a single breakthrough, but the combination of modern forensics, coordinated investigation, and persistent public memory had reopened pathways that earlier generations could not have imagined. As forensic science and public interest converged, the Colonial Parkway investigation produced a cluster of modern leads that promised progress and provoked debate. Advances in DNA analysis, digital databases, and investigative genealogy opened new avenues, while renewed media attention and online sleuthing amplified both hope and risk. This chapter traces the most consequential contemporary leads, the controversies they sparked, and how those tensions reshaped the hunt for answers. Cold case units re-examined preserved exhibits with techniques unavailable in the 1980s. Improved DNA amplification produced partial profiles from items once thought unusable. Mitochondrial and touch DNA testing sometimes narrowed possibilities to family groups rather than single individuals. Investigators used forensic genealogy in a few instances to generate investigative leads, matching partial profiles to distant relatives in public databases and then building family trees to identify persons of interest. Those methods did not automatically produce arrests, but they converted anonymous traces into names to be vetted by traditional corroboration. Alibis, service records, and independent witness statements. Some leads pointed to individuals with circumstantial ties to the parkway, men who had lived or worked near the route, who owned vehicles consistent with witness descriptions, or who had service records placing them in the region at relevant times. Law enforcement treated these leads cautiously, distinguishing persons of interest from suspects with prosecutable evidence. In several cases, intense public scrutiny followed media reports of a named person, producing reputational harm even when no charges were filed. The chapter examines how investigators balance the need to pursue leads with the legal and ethical obligation to avoid premature public accusation. The parkway's proximity to military installations produced a recurring investigative thread. Some persons of interest had military service records that placed them in the region or provided access to firearms and mobility. Military records sometimes aided timelines, but they also introduced jurisdictional complexity. Accessing service logs, duty rosters, and discharge papers required interagency cooperation and, at times, legal requests. That complexity slowed some inquiries and raised questions about how civilian and military authorities coordinate on cold cases that touch both communities. Podcasts, documentaries, and online forums revived public attention and generated new tips. Amateur investigators compiled timelines, cross-referenced vehicle sightings, and proposed suspect profiles. While some crowdsourced leads proved useful, others amplified unverified claims and targeted innocent people. The chapter explores the ethical tightrope between harnessing public energy and protecting the integrity of investigations and the privacy of individuals. It also considers how law enforcement adapted, engaging with the public to solicit corroborated tips while warning against speculative naming that could derail prosecutions. The use of genetic genealogy and familial searching provoked legal and privacy debates. Advocates argued that these tools were indispensable for solving violent crimes. Critics warned about consent, the scope of database use, and the potential for disproportionate scrutiny of certain families. Courts and legislatures grappled with policy questions. What standards should govern access to consumer DNA databases, how to protect innocent relatives, and when to disclose investigative methods in court. The chapter outlines how those debates influenced investigative choices and public trust. For victims' families, renewed leads offered a mixture of hope and re-traumatization. Each public development reopened old wounds and sometimes brought renewed scrutiny to private grief. Community trust in law enforcement waxed and waned with each announced lead and each retraction. The chapter closes by reflecting on the human cost of prolonged uncertainty and on the responsibilities investigators and media share in pursuing truth without compounding harm. By the chapter's end, modern leads had transformed the Colonial Parkway case from a set of cold files into an active, ethically fraught inquiry. Science expanded what was possible, but it also demanded new standards of care, procedural rigor, interagency cooperation, and restraint in public communication. The mystery remained unresolved in many respects, yet the renewed effort demonstrated that persistence, combined with evolving tools and careful oversight, could still move a decades-old case toward clarity. The Parkway killings left more than unanswered questions. They left a community altered by grief and a landscape marked by absence. In the years after the initial investigations, families and friends of the victims carried private losses into public life, organizing memorials, pressing for renewed inquiries, and insisting that the dead be remembered as people rather than case files. That insistence shaped how the story was told, not only as a forensic puzzle, but as a human tragedy whose consequences rippled through generations. Local commemorations began modestly: flowers at overlooks, small gatherings on anniversaries, and plaques placed by relatives and civic groups. Over time, those acts of remembrance grew more formal. Historical societies and victim advocacy organizations worked to preserve photographs, letters, and personal testimonies, creating archives that resisted the erasure of time. These collections served two purposes. They honored lives cut short, and they supplied researchers and investigators with contextual material that could inform later reviews. Mourning also produced civic reflection. Municipal leaders and law enforcement agencies convened public forums to explain investigative steps, to acknowledge past procedural shortcomings, and to solicit community input on safety measures. Improvements followed: better lighting at pullouts, clearer signage, coordinated patrol schedules, and public safety campaigns aimed at reducing the very vulnerabilities the killer had exploited. Those changes could not undo the past, but they represented a communal effort to reduce the risk of repetition and to translate grief into practical prevention. The long shadow of the crimes shaped local identity. For some residents, the Parkway became a cautionary tale told to new generations. For others, it was a wound they preferred not to reopen. Schools and civic groups incorporated the events into lessons about personal safety and civic responsibility, while historians used the case to explore how rural and suburban communities respond to violent crime. The narrative that emerged was complex, a mixture of sorrow, resilience, and an uneasy recognition that some questions might never be fully answered. Families continued to press for answers, sometimes collaborating with cold case detectives and sometimes pursuing independent research. Their persistence kept files active and encouraged agencies to adopt new technologies as they became available. At the same time, the emotional cost of repeated public attention was real. Each renewed lead or media cycle could reopen grief, and investigators learned to coordinate communications with families to minimize re-traumatization while maintaining transparency. The unresolved nature of the case also produced ethical debates about memory and closure. Some argued that a definitive arrest was the only true form of justice. Others maintained that careful historical accounting, preserving testimony, acknowledging institutional failures, and memorializing victims was itself a form of moral repair. That debate shaped how the community balanced the desire for legal resolution with the need for dignified remembrance. By the chapter's end, the Parkway story had become a layered legacy, a record of investigative effort and forensic evolution, a chronicle of communal mourning and memorialization, and a reminder that some crimes leave questions that outlast the people who first sought answers. The road remains scenic and solitary, its overlooks still places where people came to watch sunsets and to remember those who never saw another dawn. The turn of the century brought tools that earlier investigators could only imagine. Improved DNA amplification, touch DNA techniques, and computerized ballistics allowed cold case units to re-examine preserved exhibits with far greater sensitivity. Where once a degraded swab yielded nothing, analysts could now extract partial genetic markers that, when combined with other traces, transformed anonymous evidence into investigatory leads. Forensic genealogy emerged as a pivotal, if controversial, method. By matching partial profiles to distant relatives in public databases, analysts could build family trees that pointed to potential persons of interest. Those leads required traditional corroboration, service records, employment logs, and independent witness statements, so investigators treated genealogical matches as starting points rather than conclusions, mindful of the legal and ethical boundaries that govern genetic searches. military records, and mobility data reshape timelines in unexpected ways. Duty rosters, deployment logs, and vehicle registrations sometimes placed individuals in the region at critical moments, narrowing windows of opportunity or eliminating suspects with solid alibis. At the same time, accessing and interpreting those records demanded interagency cooperation and legal processes that slowed some inquiries but ultimately strengthened the evidentiary foundation when links were confirmed. The modern task force adopted a hybrid model of old-fashioned detective work and cutting-edge science. Detectives re-interviewed witnesses with trauma-informed techniques, cross-checked digital footprints, and used geospatial analysis to map likely routes and sighting clusters. That combination produced a handful of persons of interest who fit multiple independent criteria: proximity, opportunity, and forensic association. But in most cases, the surviving physical records still fell short of the threshold needed for prosecution. Public scrutiny intensified as media and online communities followed each development. Renewed attention brought new witnesses and previously unshared documents, but it also risked contaminating memories and amplifying speculation. Investigators learned to manage communications carefully, releasing verified facts, protecting the privacy of uninvolved individuals, and coordinating with families to minimize re-traumatization while keeping the public informed. Legal and ethical debates accompanied scientific progress. Courts and legislatures wrestled with standards for using consumer genetic databases, the limits of familial searching, and protections for innocent relatives. Those debates influenced investigative choices: when to seek a warrant, how to disclose methods in court, and how to balance the public interest in solving violent crimes against privacy concerns, shaping not only this inquiry but broader policy on cold case investigation. By the chapter's end, the case had been reframed. It was no longer solely a story of missed opportunities and cold files, but a live example of how evolving science, institutional reform, and sustained public memory can reopen pathways to truth. The breakthroughs did not guarantee closure, but they changed the terms of possibility. What had been lost to time could sometimes be recovered, and what had been anonymous could sometimes be traced back to a family, a vehicle, or a service record if investigators remained patient, rigorous, and ethically disciplined. The Colonial Parkway investigation forced institutions to confront not only a criminal mystery but also the limits of their own procedures and the ethical dilemmas of long-running inquiries. As forensic methods advanced and public scrutiny returned, agencies faced questions about how to balance transparency with the need to protect investigative integrity, how to use emerging genetic tools responsibly, and how to repair trust with communities and families who had waited decades for answers. Those institutional questions shaped policy reforms as much as any single evidentiary breakthrough. One practical outcome was improved evidence stewardship. Law enforcement agencies adopted standardized protocols for evidence collection, storage, and documentation to ensure that materials preserved today would remain usable for future technologies. Centralized evidence repositories and uniform chain of custody procedures reduced the risk that critical items would be lost or degraded, and regular audits became part of cold case best practices. Those reforms reflected a hard lesson. The value of future science depends on the care taken in the present. Policy debates also centered on genetic genealogy and privacy. Agencies developed stricter guidelines for when and how to use consumer DNA databases, requiring legal oversight, documented justification, and corroborating investigative steps before elevating a genealogical lead. Training programs emphasized the difference between an investigative lead and prosecutable evidence, and prosecutors worked with investigators to ensure that any genetically based inquiry met constitutional and evidentiary standards. The result was a cautious, more transparent approach that sought to harness new tools while protecting civil liberties. Accountability extended beyond technical fixes to include communication and community engagement. Law enforcement established clearer channels for family liaison, offering regular briefings and trauma-informed support to victims' relatives. Public information strategies prioritized verified updates and avoided speculative naming that could harm innocent people. Those practices aimed to rebuild trust eroded by decades of uncertainty and by earlier missteps that had sometimes amplified fear without producing answers. The case also prompted reflection in the legal system about statutes of limitations, prosecutorial discretion, and the standards for reopening cold cases. Courts and legislatures examined whether existing rules adequately balanced the rights of the accused with the public interest in resolving violent crimes, especially as new methods made identification possible long after the fact. Those debates produced incremental legal clarifications that guided how cold case units pursue long-dormant leads while safeguarding due process. Finally, the Parkway story influenced professional culture. Investigators, prosecutors, and forensic scientists incorporated the case into training curricula as an example of both failure and resilience. Failure in the sense that early procedural lapses limited later options, and resilience in the sense that sustained advocacy, improved science, and institutional reform kept the possibility of justice alive. The chapter closes by emphasizing that accountability is not a single act but an ongoing commitment, procedural, legal, and moral, to ensure that victims are remembered, evidence is preserved, and investigations are conducted with both rigor and restraint. The Colonial Parkway murders close this narrative without a single tidy resolution. Decades of investigation produced patterns, persons of interest, and forensic leads, but many evidentiary gaps remain. Degraded samples, incomplete chain of custody records, and witnesses whose memories blurred with time. Those absences are not merely technical problems. They are moral ones. Reminders that justice depends as much on careful procedure and institutional continuity as on scientific ingenuity. Communities responded to loss with acts of remembrance that honored victims and kept their stories visible. Memorials, plaques, and annual gatherings created public spaces for mourning and for insisting that the dead not be reduced to case numbers. Those rituals also served a civic function. They sustained public attention, encouraged archival preservation, and pressured institutions to maintain active files rather than consigning tragedies to oblivion. The investigation prompted concrete reforms in evidence stewardship, interagency coordination, and cold case practice. Standardized evidence protocols, centralized repositories, and formal task forces reduced the bureaucratic seams that once hindered progress. Policy debates about genetic genealogy and privacy led to stricter oversight and clearer thresholds for using consumer DNA databases in criminal inquiries, balancing investigatory power with civil liberties protections. Renewed attention brought both help and harm. Podcasts and online sleuths generated tips and new witnesses, but they also risked spreading speculation and re-traumatizing families. The case underscored the need for responsible reporting, verified facts, restraint in naming persons of interest, and coordination with investigators to avoid contaminating evidence or harming innocent lives. For victims' families, the passage of time has not diminished grief. Each forensic advance offers hope and the risk of reopening wounds. Yet the combination of improved science, institutional reform, and persistent advocacy means closure remains possible. Not guaranteed, but more attainable than it was in the 1980s. Even without a final legal resolution, careful memorialization and transparent investigation can deliver forms of accountability that matter to survivors and to civic life. The Parkway story is both a caution and a charge. Preserve evidence with rigor, coordinate across jurisdictions, use new tools with ethical safeguards, and center the dignity of victims in every public step. The road ahead requires patience, procedural care, and a communal commitment to truth, qualities that turn cold files into living responsibilities rather than forgotten archives. The Colonial Parkway murders remain a wound and a warning. Unresolved evidence, procedural lapses, and the passage of time have complicated the search for legal closure, while families and communities continue to carry the human cost. Truth and repair require three parallel commitments: rigorous evidence stewardship so future science can work, ethically governed use of genetic and digital tools, and sustained, trauma-informed engagement with victims' families. A practical memorial plan can honor lives while supporting investigation. Permanent plaques at overlooks, an online archive of verified records and family remembrances, annual public commemorations coordinated with law enforcement briefings, and a small fund for continued forensic review. Policy recommendations include standardized evidence preservation protocols across jurisdictions, formal cold case task forces with civilian oversight, clear rules and warrants for genetic genealogy, and mandatory family liaison procedures to reduce re-traumatization during renewed inquiries. The road ahead is neither quick nor simple, but it is actionable. Preserve what remains, protect privacy and due process as science advances, and center the dignity of victims in every public step.